Not just the absence of sound, but the kind of stillness that makes your bones remember ancient fear. No wind, no crickets, just cold breath meeting colder air. And then the creak, just once, from the rafters above, where no one had walked in over 100 years. That was the last thing Robert Avery heard before he disappeared. July 3rd, 1972. His flashlight was found still lit, upright in a pile of rotting hay. The locals say the barn doesn't echo anymore, like it swallowed his scream whole and kept it there, digesting it in the dark. But let's start earlier. 1837, New Canaan Community Farm. The records say it was a Christian utopia, but records lie. What you're about to hear was buried not just by time, but by design. Someone or something made sure of that. Because this story isn't just about a family. It's about a pattern, a method, a system of control so old, so effective, that it wears the mask of holiness to this day. The Colemans didn't just abuse faith, they engineered it into a trap, a blueprint, and they weren't alone. Elder Daniel Coleman, tall, charismatic, his voice described in one journal as the voice of the Lord made flesh. He spoke in parables, but ruled with iron. His eyes were ice over flame. 3 children raised like zealots, a wife half his age who called herself mother, but never gave birth again after joining him. A commune in name, but a cult in structure. And when you understand how it worked, you'll start seeing versions of it everywhere. Churches, corporations, political dynasties, algorithms. Coleman didn't just lead, he programmed. What makes a man give up his land, his wife, even his child, for a promise written in someone else's blood? Belief. But belief isn't born, it's carved. In New Canaan, salvation had a price, and it always started the same way. Give up the world, and the world will give up on you. What happened next can't be explained with reason alone, because this place, it wasn't just corrupted, it was fed.
He came with his wife, 4 children, and a mule so old it collapsed halfway up the Coleman Trail. They left behind a failed farm in Pennsylvania and arrived with empty pockets but full hearts. Elias had seen Elder Daniel's ad in a Lancaster newspaper. A new Eden awaits. Leave the world. Join the faithful. They answered the call, and in return, Elias was given a patch of land, a shared bunkhouse, and a task: to obey without question. Within days, his wife no longer spoke above a whisper. His children were renamed, not by choice, but by command. Names of the flesh carry sin, new names for new souls. They were baptized in the creek at midnight. No candles, no hymns, just water, cold as death, and silence deeper than prayer. This was no ordinary farm. This was a system of engineered purity. Families were divided, homes were reassigned, and men worked 14-hour days in fields while Elder Daniel delivered divine dictations from the main house porch, eyes rolled back, speaking in tongues that no one had heard before or since. They called it the awakening, and those who resisted, they were put to trial, a ritual held in the cellar of the old stone chapel, which had no windows and no records. Some never came out. Locals began to notice, but the Colemans were strategic. They donated food to nearby towns, mended roads, offered sermons to the curious. Outwardly, they were saints. Inwardly, architects of spiritual dissection. They didn't break bodies, they broke wills. One traveler described New Canaan like this: a place where people smiled with dead eyes, where even the birds stopped singing after dusk. There were no dogs, no cats. Animals didn't last long there. Something in the air, maybe, or something deeper. And yet, the commune grew. More families arrived, more children were born under Coleman law. No toys, no books, only scripture and service. A new child would be raised communally, stripped of family ties. The blood must be diluted so that the soul can rise unbound. And still, no one left, not without a mark. No one left. They were bound by more than belief.
He was building a machine, a living, breathing organism powered by faith, fear, and obedience. And like all great machines, it had gears and sacrifices. Each family that arrived added another layer, more mouths to feed, more hands to work, more minds to mold, but also more witnesses, more potential cracks in the facade. So Elder Daniel created the ritual of silence. Every Saturday night, after sundown, the community gathered in the chapel. The children were taken to the barn. The adults stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, arms crossed over their chests, heads bowed. A horn, made from the hollowed femur of a mule, was blown 3 times. No one spoke, not even the babies cried. And then he would come in. Daniel Coleman, wearing a robe of coarse black wool, hand-stitched with red thread that wasn't quite thread. It glistened in the torchlight, shimmered like something alive. His voice, when he spoke, didn't echo, even in the stone room. Do you renounce the world? We renounce. Do you submit your mind, your body, your lineage? We submit. That wasn't faith. That was formatting. What Daniel was doing wasn't religion. It was programming humans like code, wiping them clean, rewriting them line by line. The language of this cult was ancient and terrifying in its precision. And the deeper you went, the harder it became to think outside of it. The rituals were psychological warfare disguised as salvation. But here's what most don't understand. The rituals weren't for control alone. They were feeding something. In a sealed journal, found decades later in a root cellar, hidden behind a false wall, one phrase was repeated over and over. He walks the rows, he watches the blood. That wasn't metaphor. It wasn't madness. Multiple accounts speak of a figure, always seen at the edge of the fields during the rituals of silence, tall, cloaked, never approaching, never speaking, but always there, witnessing. The children called him the Scare Father. Elder Daniel called him the first witness. Was it mass hallucination? Symbolic projection? By the winter of 1839, New Canaan was no longer a settlement. It was a sealed world. No one outside its borders truly knew what went on beneath those heavy clouds and timber walls. And no one inside could remember life before the commandments of Elder Daniel Coleman. Not because they didn't try, but because he erased them. That winter, Daniel introduced a new ritual, the burning of the past. Each member of the community was ordered to bring their worldly possessions, photographs, journals, heirlooms, even wedding rings, and cast them into a roaring fire in the center of the valley.
Daniel stood barefoot in the snow, chanting scripture of his own creation, reciting passages that merged biblical cadence with something much darker, something not meant for ears, but for summoning. Witnesses described the smoke as unnatural. It didn't rise, it crawled. One man, Nathaniel Bower, refused. He held on to a small locket containing his mother's portrait. That night, the barn caught fire. 3 livestock were burned alive. The next morning, Nathaniel was found kneeling in front of the chapel, his hair singed, his tongue cut out. He never disobeyed again. Daniel didn't need whips or chains. He had ritual and consequence. He claimed to receive visions from the source, not God, not Christ, but something deeper, older than Eden, he said, the voice behind the veil. His sermons began to shift, less about salvation, more about ascension through obedience and cleansing through loss. Sarah Coleman, Mother Sarah, began appearing less and less. When she did, her face was veiled. Some said she was ill. Others whispered she had seen something in one of Daniel's vision chambers, something that broke her. Children were no longer raised by their parents. They were separated into creeds, grouped by their aptitude to obey, to memorize, to suffer. At age 10, each child was taken to the white cellar beneath the chapel and left overnight. No candles, no food, no sound, just darkness and the voice. Some emerged changed, distant, robotic. Some didn't emerge at all. And yet the community thrived. Crops bloomed in frozen soil. Diseases passed over New Canaan like smoke. It was as if nature itself feared Daniel Coleman. But what they were building, it wasn't human anymore. It wasn't community. It was an altar. And it was being prepared for something that had not yet arrived.
In the spring of 1840, the dreams began. They spread like illness, first among the children, then the mothers, then the laborers. But these weren't normal dreams. These were shared, synchronized as if directed by a single broadcasting force. Dreams of ash falling from the sky, of rivers turning black, of a figure, tall, faceless, crowned in thorns, walking through the cornfields without leaving footprints. They called it the Shepherd of the Hollow. Children woke up screaming, their eyes wide but unfocused. Some wouldn't speak for days. Others began drawing symbols they'd never been taught. Sigils that matched the carvings found beneath the chapel's floorboards, some of which predated English colonization. Symbols even Daniel had never shown them. But he didn't rebuke the dreams. He welcomed them. He called them rehearsals of revelation, messages from the first witness, warnings for the unworthy, blueprints for the chosen. He said New Canaan was being watched, and judgment would come, not in the form of wrath, but in selection. Those who proved themselves would merge with the will of the source. The others, they would be unmade. It was around this time that a young boy named Ezra Coleman, Daniel's youngest son, was seen wandering the fields at night, alone, whispering in a language no one recognized. His sister, Rebecca, claimed he could hear things through the soil.
"She says the dirt talks when you're quiet enough," she once told a woman in the bakery. "It tells him who's next." By midsummer, Ezra stopped speaking entirely. He would only stare, long, unblinking, as if measuring your soul. And then came the first thinning. Elder Daniel stood before the gathered community and announced that 12 souls must walk away to make room for the flame. No one knew what that meant. No one dared ask. The next morning, 12 people were gone. No ceremony, no goodbyes, no graves. Only their shoes, neatly placed in front of the chapel doors. From that day on, everyone walked barefoot. The symbolism was clear. You belong to the land now. No footprints, no trace, no memory. Because memory in New Canaan was the final sin. And what Daniel wanted, what the thing behind Daniel needed, was emptiness.
The air grew thicker, not with heat, but with weight. Birds stopped nesting near the commune. Bees abandoned their hives. The stream that once babbled cheerfully across the farm became eerily still, reflecting not the sky, but something deeper, darker. And the people, those who remained, they were no longer people in the way you or I understand. They moved in sync. They spoke only when required. They stared too long and blinked too little. It was as if some core part of their humanity had been excavated and replaced with ritual. Elder Daniel called it the refinement. In one of his final sermons before the harvest, he said, "The flesh must be trimmed so the spirit can bloom, and the spirit, once bloomed, must die to itself and rise again in the shape of the watcher." His followers cheered, but with no joy in their eyes, only hunger. By this time, the Coleman children had assumed new roles. Rebecca, now 17, was known as the Vessel Bride, a title never explained but always feared. Her skin had grown pale, almost translucent. Her voice, once soft, now vibrated with unnatural resonance. It was said she could read sins by touching your shoulder. Joshua, the eldest, had become the Harrower, a title marked by a necklace of vertebrae he wore around his throat. His job? To test the faith of others, to punish deviation, to decide who would be marked for the next cycle. And Ezra, the boy who whispered to the soil? He no longer appeared at all. But sometimes at night, villagers miles away reported seeing a pale child standing in the fields outside New Canaan, his face wrapped in black cloth, unmoving, watching. The final transformation came with the black rain. It lasted only one day, but what fell wasn't rain. It was thick, oily, and when it touched the ground, it sank, vanished. No puddles, no residue, only an echoing hum in the bones of anyone who stepped outside. After the rain, Daniel claimed the source had chosen its host. The barn was sealed. The next 3 days were spent in fasting, silence, and digging. And then, on the third night, the chapel lights ignited by themselves. No one was seen entering, but everyone inside the valley claimed they heard the same words. The chapel was never the same after that night. Before, it was just stone and wood, austere, plain, built by trembling hands and blind faith. But after the black rain, something in its architecture had shifted. People spoke of the walls breathing, of shadows that curved against the natural angles of candlelight, and of whispers that no longer waited for silence. You didn't enter the chapel anymore. It entered you. From that night forward, Elder Daniel no longer spoke during daylight.
His sermons happened in the dark. He said the source had awakened fully and that the sun now belonged to the old world, that in the darkness the truth could shed its skin and reveal its face. Anyone who refused the nightly sermons was branded behind the ear with a hot iron in the shape of a spiral, a mark Daniel called the mercy of reminder. The spiral appears in no Christian texts, but it does appear on cave walls throughout ancient Mesopotamia, in burial chambers in Nubia, even carved into the teeth of unearthed Neolithic skulls from Scotland to Siberia. It is not a symbol of God. It is a symbol of submission to something older. And now it belonged to New Canaan. That spring, outsiders began disappearing. A trapper, 2 fur traders, a Union Army surveyor named Whitlock, who'd been sent to map the river for future expansion, all gone without trace. The sheriff of Athens County finally sent a deputy to investigate. He never made it back. His horse returned alone, with a note tied to its saddle. 6 words burned into the parchment. They are not like us now. No one else went in. From then on, New Canaan was blacked out on local maps. Roads that once led to the valley were torn up. Locals whispered of curses and plagues, but no one would admit what they heard on certain windless nights. Chanting, not English, not Latin, not anything known, but rhythmic, deep, and coming from the direction of the chapel, like the valley itself was singing. By midsummer, Daniel no longer referred to himself as elder. He called himself the mouth of the hollow. And in one final letter, intercepted by accident, never mailed, he wrote, "When the flesh is gone, only the voice remains. I am almost ready to be voice alone."
By the fall of 1841, the land surrounding New Canaan had begun to decay. Not rot, not famine, but a slow, methodical unraveling, as though the very fabric of reality around the commune was thinning. Trees near the borders began growing in twisted, spiral patterns. Deer were born without eyes. The riverbanks blackened. Sound no longer carried through the valley. Hunters said if you fired a gun near New Canaan, it made no echo. The silence was absolute. And yet, from within that void came something worse than noise, something ancient, something summoning. At night, faint bell chimes would drift into nearby towns. No one had a bell that large, no wind strong enough to carry it, but people heard it, and with it came dreams, shared dreams. Men in surrounding towns would wake screaming, clutching their chests, convinced something had been watching them from inside their own reflections. Women miscarried without warning. Livestock dropped dead by the dozens. When doctors opened the animals, they found the hearts turned to stone, literally calcified, fossilized, as if time inside the valley was fracturing. Inside New Canaan, Daniel had finished what he called the mouth's ascension. He no longer ate, no longer slept. His eyes, if they could be called that anymore, were black and glassy. Witnesses said looking into them was like staring down a well where something waited and breathed back. The chapel had become the mouth room, its floor painted in concentric circles of ash, blood, and lye. In the center, a hole, freshly dug, but impossibly deep. They called it the listening pit. No one dared look into it for more than a second. Those who did were taken by vertigo. One man, Samuel Crane,
tore out his own eyes the next morning with a dinner fork. And Rebecca? She no longer answered to her name. She was now the vessel. Always barefoot, always silent. Her mouth stitched closed with horsehair, her eyes painted black with pitch. During ceremonies, she stood beside the listening pit, unmoving for hours, and from somewhere beneath her feet came a noise.
The first outsider to make it back out of New Canaan in over 2 years didn't walk, he crawled. October 2nd, 1841. A fur trapper named Malcolm Graves stumbled into the village of Chauncey, Ohio, half naked, covered in blood that wasn't his, muttering a single phrase over and over again. The pit doesn't end. The pit doesn't end. The pit doesn't end. He died that night in the sheriff's barn, vomiting black bile that burned through the floorboards like acid. Before he lost consciousness, he said one more thing, something most would dismiss as madness. They were wearing skin that didn't fit. Something inside them didn't know how to be human anymore. A physician who examined his body later wrote in a private letter that Graves' internal organs were misaligned, as if rearranged on purpose. His lungs were partially reversed, his ribs bent inward, his tongue had been branded with a spiral. He wasn't just a witness. He was a warning. From that day forward, no one from any neighboring town went near the valley. Even saying New Canaan aloud was considered bad luck. Horses would refuse to ride that direction. Mail routes were remapped. County records were quietly adjusted, property lines erased. The land became a non-place. But inside the hollow, the transformation continued. Daniel had now withdrawn fully from the people. His voice, once booming and magnetic, was now only heard through others. Every dawn, a different follower would rise, possessed, eyes rolled back, speaking in tongues that seemed to tear at the seams of language itself. The spiral sermons, they were called. And during these sermons, the soil would shift, the ground would breathe, the barn doors, long sealed, would creak open, and something inside would moan. A deep, wet, hungry sound that had no business existing in this world. There were no more births, no more seasons. The land was no longer bound by time. And the children, those who had once run through the fields in laughter, had changed. They now moved in clusters, humming in perfect unison, speaking only in riddles, drawing diagrams of impossible shapes. Some had begun walking on all fours. One girl, Annabeth, had teeth growing on the outside of her cheeks. Daniel claimed it was the shedding, that the old forms must be broken so the true shape can emerge. New Canaan was no longer waiting for its God.
There comes a point in every descent when return is no longer possible. New Canaan passed that threshold in 1842. The final census showed 72 souls living within the commune, but they were no longer people, not in any traditional sense. Their names vanished from church records. Their letters stopped. Their eyes, those who were seen by passing hunters, glowed faintly red, like coals glimpsed through smoke. And then came the hollow birth. No one knows what it was, only that it happened on the longest night of the year, December 21st. The chapel bells rang without hands to strike them. The soil outside the listening pit cracked open and pulsed as though breathing from below. Witnesses on the edge of the valley saw a column of smoke rise straight into the sky and hang there, unmoving, for 9 hours. No fire, just smoke. Then silence, and then laughter. Not human laughter, not madness either, something more terrifying. Joy. Joy that had never learned to be human.
joy that didn't belong in this world. And in that moment, everything changed. Daniel Coleman emerged from the chapel, barefoot, head-shaved, wearing robes that shimmered like wet bone. He announced the end of the flesh era. His followers knelt and removed their tongues with rusted knives, one by one, placing them in the pit. There was no screaming, only acceptance. He claimed the source had found its voice, and that he, Daniel, had given birth to it. It now lived within the land, and in time it would live in others, in anyone willing to erase themselves entirely. He called it the Great Inversion. Not a fall from grace, but a fall into something deeper. You see, this wasn't about worship. It was about merging, not praising the divine, but hosting it, not ascending into light, but descending into perfect, selfless obedience. A hollow vessel, untainted by ego, memory, or fear. Daniel had built New Canaan for one reason: to teach human beings how to unbecome. And now, I need you to do something. If you've come this far, if your pulse hasn't slowed but sharpened, I want you to comment below, "I am not what they made me." Twice. Because after this point, you don't just watch this story.
By early 1843, no maps marked the valley anymore. New Canaan had vanished from the official world. Not with fire, not with force, but with something more powerful: erasure. It was as if the land itself had been pulled inward, folded like a sheet of parchment and tucked behind a mirror. What remained was a hollow on the map, a silence in the archives. Surveyors who dared enter would return days later unable to explain where they'd been. They'd cry when shown compasses, scream when touched. One man dug out both his ears, convinced he could still hear Daniel Coleman's voice inside his head. But Daniel hadn't spoken in months, not in words, because now the valley spoke for him. Those few who survived encounters with the edges of the hollow told stories that don't belong in any rational world. Trees that wept black sap when spoken to. A low thrumming in the soil as though something massive was turning just beneath the roots. And always, always, that unbearable feeling of being watched from below. Some say the chapel doors no longer led into the building. They led downward, straight into something old enough to remember the stars before they burned. One local, Jacob Callister, a farmer whose fields bordered the east slope, claimed to see a procession in the fog. Dozens of pale figures walking barefoot through snow, heads tilted backward, mouths open as if waiting for rain. Their arms were bound not with rope, but braided hair. Behind them walked a tall man, wrapped in linen stitched with human teeth. When Jacob called out, they stopped. All at once, and without a sound, they turned their heads. He ran. He never stopped screaming. Jacob died 3 days later, scratching spirals into the walls of his cabin until his fingernails tore off. The coroner's report was suppressed because by now authorities weren't just afraid of New Canaan. They were afraid of the infection it represented. Not a virus, not possession, but an idea, a sacred virus, capable of turning human beings into willing conduits for something not of this earth. And that idea had a name. Daniel Coleman never wrote it, but on the final page of a burnt ledger found in the ashes of the chapel, 5 letters were scratched in human blood. S-H-A-O-L. Not a god, not a demon, but a threshold. And New Canaan?